Imagine it is the 14th of September 2007. You are a 41-year-old mortgage broker living in Newcastle, England. Your house is worth twice what you paid for it 7 years ago. Your pension is growing. Your kids are in good schools. You have £30,000 sitting in a Northern Rock savings account because your financial advisor told you it was the safest bank. You drive to work past the same shops you have driven past for 15 years. The coffee shop, the newsagent, the estate agent with its window full of properties climbing every week. Life is not perfect, but life is stable. Life makes sense. You trust the institutions around you the way you trust the floor beneath your feet. If you have ever wondered why, economic collapses always seem to shock everyone, even though the warning signs were hiding in plain sight for years. Stay with me. What you are about to hear is not a theory. It is a pattern. It has happened before. It happened in Germany. It happened in Japan. It happened in Argentina. It happened in the United States. It happened in your lifetime. And it always ends the same way. The people who saw it coming were not smarter than everyone else. They just knew what to look for. And if you find value here, subscribing takes 2 seconds and keeps you ahead of what most people never see coming. On that morning of September 14th, 2007, you wake up and turn on the radio, and you hear something that does not seem possible. There's a queue outside Northern Rock. Not a short queue. A queue that wraps around the block. People are waiting before dawn. They are waiting to take their money out. Because Northern Rock, one of Britain's most respected mortgage lenders, has just become the first British bank to suffer a bank run. Within days, ordinary savers will pull out more than £2 billion. Within months, the bank will be nationalized. And within a year, the entire global financial system will be on edge. You did not see it coming. Neither did your neighbors. Neither did the experts on television. But here is what history teaches us. The warning signs were there. They're always there. And they always follow the same pattern. This video is about 3 warning signs that appear before every major economic collapse. Not every collapse looks the same on the surface, but underneath, the mechanics are almost identical. Once you learn to read them, you will never look at an economy the same way again. Before we go further, understand something important. Economic collapses do not happen because of a single bad decision or a single bad day. They are not like earthquakes that strike without warning from a stable ground. They are more like sinkholes. The surface looks solid. People walk across it every day without a second thought. But underneath, the ground has been hollowing out for years, sometimes for decades. Water has been eroding the bedrock. And then one morning, the surface gives way, and everyone says they never saw it coming, but the hollowing was happening. The reason this matters is because every major collapse in modern economic history has been preceded by the same underground erosion. 3 specific patterns appear in the data and the behavior long before the sinkhole opens up. These are not obscure academic indicators that only central bank economists can read. They are visible, they are measurable, and they are almost always ignored. The mechanism works like this. Economies are built on confidence. Confidence is built on trust. Trust is built on the belief that the numbers are real and institutions are solid, and that tomorrow will look roughly like today. When these 3 things are true, the system holds. When they start to quietly become untrue, the hollowing begins. The 3 warning signs are the visible cracks in that confidence, that trust, and that stability. Now let us look at each one, starting with the one that appears first. The first warning sign is debt that grows faster than income. This sounds simple, almost too simple, but the historical record is devastating in how consistently this signal appears before collapse. The basic logic is this: when individuals, corporations, or governments borrow money, they are making a promise about the future. They are saying that income tomorrow will cover debt today. That works as long as income keeps growing. But when debt grows faster than income, the promise starts to become mathematically impossible to keep. The gap keeps widening. The promise gets further and further from reality. And at some point, reality reasserts itself. Always. Look at what happened in Japan starting in the late 1980s. Japan in 1989 was an economic miracle. The country had rebuilt itself from the devastation of World War II into the second largest economy on earth. Japanese companies were buying landmarks. Japanese real estate was so valuable that the land under the Imperial Palace in Tokyo was estimated to be worth more than all of the real estate in California. The Nikkei stock index, which tracks how well the biggest Japanese companies are performing, had risen 300% in just 5 years. Everything looked magnificent, but debt was alarming. Between 1985 and 1989, Japanese bank lending grew at a rate of roughly 10 to 13% per year. Japanese corporations and individuals were borrowing enormous sums to buy stocks. They were buying assets with borrowed money and then using those assets as collateral to borrow even more money to buy even more assets. The income was not growing that way. The debt was racing ahead of the ability to repay it. Real estate prices in major Japanese cities tripled between 1985 and 1990. Stock prices did the same. It felt like wealth, but it was borrowed wealth, paper wealth, wealth built on promises about a future that could not actually support the weight of those promises. When interest rates were finally raised, the cost of carrying all that debt suddenly became unbearable. Asset prices collapsed. The Nikkei fell from nearly 39,000 in December 1989 to below 17,000 by 1992. Real estate prices fell by 80% in some areas over the following decade. Japanese banks were left with enormous piles of loans that would never be repaid. Economists call these non-performing loans, meaning loans where the borrower has stopped paying and the money is not coming back. Japan spent the 1990s in the lost decade. This was a 10-year period of economic stagnation, deflation, and despair. An entire generation of Japanese people saw their savings decimated, their companies collapse, and their futures shrink. And the warning sign had been in the debt numbers the whole time. This brings us directly to something I want you to think about before we go further. When you look at that Japanese story, you see something that appears over and over. The people living through the boom almost never see the warning sign. This is because the warning sign is disguised as prosperity. Rising asset prices feel like wealth creation. Abundant credit feels like opportunity. Fast debt growth feels like progress. Here is the question I want you to consider. Can you think of a period in your own lifetime when debt seemed to be growing in a way that felt exciting? Drop your answer in the comments. Seriously. Because what I am about to show you next is the part of this story that most people never hear. It changes everything. The second warning sign is the concentration of wealth combined with the disappearance of the middle economic buffer. This one is more uncomfortable because it touches on politics and class, but the historical data is not political. It is simply consistent. In the period before most major economic collapses, wealth concentrates rapidly into fewer and fewer hands while the middle loses. Ordinary workers and small businesses gradually lose their financial cushion. The economic buffer disappears, and when an economy loses its buffer, it loses its shock absorbers. Any disruption, no matter how moderate, becomes catastrophic. Think about what happened in the United States in the years leading up to 1929. By 1928, the top 1% dominated. They controlled roughly 19 to 24% of all national income. That is not a normal figure. In healthy, stable economies, that kind of concentration tends to be much lower. The wealth had flowed upward through the roaring 1920s as stock markets surged and new industries boomed. Meanwhile, American farmers had been struggling with falling crop prices since 1920. Agricultural debt had been piling up for years before Wall Street even noticed, and the industrial workers who were producing record amounts of goods did not have the wages to buy them. The factories were selling partly on credit. American consumers were buying cars, radios, and refrigerators on installment plans, paying a little each month. Consumer debt tripled. When the stock market crashed in October 1929, it did not just destroy the wealth of the rich. It exposed how thin the financial cushion of the middle class had become. Banks failed in waves. More than 9,000 American banks failed between 1930 and 1933. Each failure wiped out the savings of ordinary depositors. There was no federal insurance then. If your bank failed, your money simply vanished. By 1932, unemployment in the United States had reached 25%. 1 in 4 Americans who wanted to work could not. But here is the part of this story that gets lost in the drama of the crash itself. The crash did not create the poverty. It revealed it. The farmers were already broke. The workers were already overextended. The middle buffer was already gone. The crash simply made it impossible to pretend otherwise. Now here is where it gets interesting. The same pattern of wealth concentration and middle-class erosion appeared with remarkable precision before the 2008 financial crisis. Research published after 2008 showed inequality reached 1929 levels. The top 1% had captured roughly 65% of all income growth between 2002 and 2007. Meanwhile, median American household income had actually declined slightly in real terms. Accounting for inflation, families were not actually getting richer. They were getting into more debt to feel richer. The housing boom gave millions of Americans the sensation of rising wealth, but that sensation was borrowed. When the housing market turned, the buffer was gone, and the fall had nothing to cushion it. What happened to ordinary Americans in 2008 is a story of exactly what happens when the middle buffer disappears. Between 2007 and 2010, American households lost a combined estimated $13 trillion in net worth, which means the total value of everything they owned minus everything they owed. Millions lost their homes. Retirement accounts were gutted. Small businesses that survived for generations were wiped out, not because they had done anything wrong, but because the credit that kept their supply chains moving simply froze. The mechanism was the same one that had hollowed out Japan. It would hollow out economies again and again. When wealth concentrates and the middle buffer erodes, the system loses its resilience. Resilience is the hidden foundation of every stable economy. At this point, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Most people will never know what you now know. They will keep trusting the numbers on their screens represent real wealth. If you're still here, you're not most people, hit subscribe, because the next section is the part this channel was made for, the part they never put in textbooks, the part about the third warning sign, the one that appears last, and the one that almost guarantees that what follows will not be a correction, but a collapse. The third warning sign is the loss of institutional credibility combined with the flight from accountability. In simpler words, it is when institutions supposed to warn the public start reassuring them. They start telling you the water is fine, right as the sharks are circling. This is not just cynical, it is a measurable, repeatable phenomenon that appears in the historical record. And when it appears, the collapse that follows tends to be the most severe. Look at what happened in Argentina in the years leading up to 2001. Argentina in the 1990s was being held up as a model for developing countries. The International Monetary Fund, which lends to countries in distress, praised Argentina repeatedly. In 1991, Argentina had pegged its peso to the US dollar at a 1-to-1 exchange rate. This is called a currency peg, meaning the government promised fixed value. This gave the country stability and attracted foreign investment. And for a while, it worked. GDP growth was strong through the mid-1990s. Inflation was tamed, international investors poured money in. But underneath the visible stability, the problems were accumulating. Argentina's economy was structured in a way that made it very expensive to produce goods competitively on world markets. When the US dollar strengthened dramatically in the late 1990s, Argentine products became more expensive because the peso was locked to the dollar. Argentina started losing export competitiveness. The economy started to stall, and then it started to contract. Government revenues fell. Borrowing increased. The debt-to-GDP ratio started climbing dangerously as a measure of the economy's size. Here is where the loss of institutional credibility becomes critical. In 2001, as the crisis was accelerating, the Argentine government and its advisors kept issuing reassurances that the peg would hold. The IMF continued to provide lending and essentially endorsed the strategy. Argentine officials told the public repeatedly that the situation was under control right up until December. Official statements projected confidence. And then, on December 1st, 2001, the government announced the Corralito. It was a restriction on bank withdrawals that fenced in people's money. Ordinary Argentines were suddenly told they could only withdraw 250 pesos per week from their own bank accounts. Their own money was locked away from them without choice. What happened in 2002 is a vivid illustration of what collapse feels like. Thousands took to the streets. The president resigned. Argentina went through 5 presidents in 2 weeks. The peso peg was finally abandoned in January 2002. The peso immediately crashed in value by roughly 70%. Middle-class Argentines who saved in dollars were devastated. Their savings had been forcibly converted to pesos and then immediately lost most of their value. A person with $10,000 effectively woke up with $3,000 purchasing power overnight, without warning, except with all the warnings that had been available, had anyone known how to read them. Now observe what all of these cases have in common. Japan, the United States in 1929, the United States in 2008, Argentina in 2001. They all followed the same 3-stage sequence. First, debt grew faster than income for an extended period. Second, wealth concentrated while the middle economic buffer thinned. Third, the institutions responsible for sounding the alarm either failed to see danger or chose not to report it. They actively provided reassurance right up until the moment of collapse. The mechanism is the same. The countries are different. The decades are different. The currencies are different. But the architecture of the disaster is identical every single time. Think of these 3 warning signs as a kind of diagnostic checklist, like a doctor looking at symptoms. No single symptom guarantees a specific disease, but when all 3 symptoms appear together in this sequence, the historical record tells a very consistent story. It does not end well. This brings us to the most important and uncomfortable part of this analysis: who actually gets hurt when these collapses arrive? Because the answer is not everyone. The distribution of pain is not random. It is almost perfectly predictable. Understanding who gets hurt and why is the key to understanding what the survivors did differently. In every major collapse, the groups who suffered the most devastating and permanent losses shared a set of characteristics. They held wealth in conventional systems of the collapsing economy. They held savings in domestic bank accounts. They held pension funds denominated in the local currency. They owned small businesses dependent on local consumer spending. They had limited access elsewhere. They had no financial presence outside their own country. They trusted the institutions around them. And that trust was their primary vulnerability. Look at what happened in Greece. During the debt crisis of 2010 to 2018, Greece entered the euro system in 2001 and borrowed heavily to fund public wages, pensions, and the 2004 Olympic Games. Cheap borrowing was suddenly available in a way it never had been before. By 2009, government debt stood at around 113% of GDP, exceeding the whole economy's output. When the 2008 crisis exposed Greek finances, international confidence collapsed. Greece suddenly could not borrow new money to roll over its old debts. What followed was 8 years of austerity. Government spending cuts and tax increases designed to bring balance were enacted. Between 2008 and 2013, Greece's economy shrank by 25%. That is a massive contraction. To put that in context, the U.S. economy shrank by 4% in its worst year of the Great Depression. Greece lost a quarter of its entire output. Unemployment reached 27%. Youth unemployment reached 60%. Greek pensioners who had worked their entire lives and saved faithfully within the system saw their pensions cut multiple times by the state. The very people who had done everything right by the rules of their society were the ones who paid the heaviest price when the rules collapsed. Contrast that with wealthy Greeks. Those who had assets in Swiss bank accounts, German property, or dollar investments survived. The crisis was painful but not existential for them. They did not lose everything. The crisis stripped ordinary Greeks of their financial foundation while leaving those with diversified assets with the structure of their wealth largely intact. The pain was not evenly distributed. The same pattern appeared in Lebanon, starting in 2019. The Lebanese pound collapsed in value by more than 90%. Ordinary citizens who held savings in pounds lost their power. The middle class was functionally wiped out financially in less than 2 years. Meanwhile, well-connected individuals had been moving money out of Lebanese banks in the months before the crisis. The architecture of who gets hurt and who does not in these crises follows a recognizable pattern. The question is not whether it will repeat. History has answered that. The only question is whether you will see it before it sees you. If this channel helps you think differently about the world, subscribe. It costs nothing and changes everything. Before we talk about what survivors did, be clear about what this is not. This is not financial advice. This channel does not tell people what to do with money. That is not appropriate for a history channel. And what we can do is describe what people who came through these periods most intact had in common, not as a prescription, but as a pattern. Because patterns are what history teaches us. The record shows survivors tended to share 3 observable characteristics. First, they reduced exposure to fragile systems. They were not immune, but they had shifted away from assets most vulnerable to the specific mechanism of the crisis. In Weimar Germany in 1923, hyperinflation destroyed the mark. A loaf of bread that cost 250 marks in January cost 200,000 million marks by November. People who preserved wealth moved savings into physical goods or foreign currencies before the catastrophe. Second, survivors tended to have maintained some form of financial presence outside the collapsing system. This did not necessarily mean they were wealthy, just that they were connected. They had some portion of savings in a currency or asset class not tied to the domestic system under stress. In Cyprus, in 2013, the government imposed a forced seizure. They took between 6 and 10% of bank deposits above 100,000 euros. People hardest hit were those whose savings existed entirely within the Cypriot banking system. Others were not touched. Third, survivors tended to be people who paid attention to the signals rather than the reassurances. They read the warning signs, not as experts, but as observers of the gap. They noticed when debt was growing faster than income. They noticed when the rhetoric of stability became loudest, right as the foundations were most unstable. They moved deliberately and early. Now we return to Newcastle in September 2007, to the 41-year-old mortgage broker with £30,000 in Northern Rock. In the aftermath, the bank was nationalized by the government. Depositors with savings up to £35,000 were protected by a government guarantee raised in the panic. Our mortgage broker did not lose their money, but the economy transformed. The mortgage market froze. Jobs disappeared. The housing market entered a long contraction. Life after September 2007 was not the same life as before. The warning signs had been visible. UK household debt had roughly doubled. British banks were deeply exposed to complex financial products built on bundles of American home loans destined to default. Reassurances had been continuous. Then one morning, the cue appeared and the world changed. The 3 warning signs were there before Japan's lost decade and the Great Depression. They were there before Argentina's default. They were there before Greece's collapse and Lebanon's implosion. They were there before 2008, debt growing faster than income, the erosion of the middle buffer, the loss of accountability. These signals form a pattern across a century of history. The sinkhole forms underground while the surface looks solid. Those who recognized the hollowing tended to be the ones who survived. This is historical and educational analysis. Every individual situation is different. Please consult a qualified professional before making any financial decision. The purpose is to help you read the world. The decisions are always yours. This video is not for everyone. Most will dismiss it. They will say the world is different now and we have better tools and institutions. Perhaps they are right. Perhaps this time the patterns will not hold. But if someone in your life needs to hear these names and understand what they mean, share this. Not because it will change the world, but because it might change their world. Subscribe for more, and I will see you in the next one.